Hey everybody, this is Stefani Rupert. Thank you for tuning in to the Meaning of Everything podcast, where we talk about actually genius ideas. Today is episode number 20, and I'm having on one of my most influential thinkers. His name is Michael Hogue, and he studies ways in which we think about nature and how that matters for politics. Okay, so a little bit of a fangirl moment. Actually, this is a bit of a fangirl month for me, bringing on a lot of people who have been really influential to my thinking over the course of the last several years. Today's guest, Michael Hogue, is a scholar at Meadville Lombard Theological Institute, and I began reading his books, 8 years ago, about. And the first of his books that I encountered was a book about this field in the world called religious naturalism. And religious naturalism is basically comprised of people, largely scholars, but not exclusively, people who are really interested in ways in which to relate to the world that are religious or spiritual, and also naturalistic, which is to say, fully supportive of the sciences and wanting to embrace a scientific worldview. And so the work that he did exploring that field and explaining that field to me and teaching me about what religious naturalism has to offer was really important for me. He's since written more books, and I have read them, and recently published one that I read last week that I found brilliant. And so we'll focus on that a little bit today and really dig into these ideas that we have about religion and about nature and how they're so intertwined with politics. And he's making some really interesting arguments about democracy and what we need to keep our democracy alive. So without further ado, I think I will jump in. I don't have any housekeeping items today. This is the meaning of everything, and I adore you as an audience, so thank you so much for listening. All I have to express is gratitude. One thing I will do is I will read to you a little bit about Professor Hogue's background, so you can know a little bit more about where he's coming from. Michael Hogue, this is his official bio, joined the Meadville Lombard faculty in September 2005. He teaches and writes at the intersection of theology, religious ethics, and philosophy of religion. He is particularly influenced by the pragmatist, process, and naturalist lineages of American philosophy of religion, which he refers to as the, and I quote, left wing of American radical theology. As a scholar and teacher, he uses these traditions to explore issues related to religion and the environment, political theology, religion and science, and social ethics. Dr. Hogue has served in leadership capacities in diverse religious, academic, and activist contexts. He has served on program committees at the American Academy of Religion as co-founder and past convener of Oikos and many other different journals. His published articles have appeared in Literature and Theology, Zygon, Journal of Religion and Science, Cross Currents, the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, the American Journal of Theology and Philosophy, and much more. He is the author of 3 books, The Tangled Bank, The Promise of Religious Naturalism, and most recently, the book I read last week, American Eminence, Democracy for an Uncertain World. So, without further ado, here is Professor Michael Hogue. Hi, Mike. Welcome to The Meaning of Everything.
Hi, Stephanie. It's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I was just telling everybody how much I have looked forward to having a conversation with you for years.
Well, that's really nice to know. I understand, you read one of my books in a class with Wesley Wildman at Boston University.
Yeah, that is correct. And so this was a course on religious naturalism, and your book, Mike wrote a book called The Promise of Religious Naturalism, was very helpful for me understanding, the lay of the land and working comparatively within that field, which was very, very, very helpful.
That's good to know. Thanks.
Yeah. Did that work? Did that come out of a dissertation, or it has a bit of a dissertation feel to it? I was curious.
Sure. No, it didn't actually. my dissertation was a book called The Tangled Bank, and it was towards an eco-theological ethics of responsible participation. That sounds very dissertation-y, and it was. The Tangled Bank comes from the last paragraphs of Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species. Mm-hmm. And I use that metaphor in my dissertation as a way to think through our human moral entanglements with the natural world, and did a comparative kind of thing with a couple of thinkers in that book, James Gustafson and Hans Jonas. And really what I was looking at was moral anthropology in that book. And by that, I mean an account of the human moral condition, human moral capacities that explores those capacities in a naturalistic context that is also sensitive to religious and philosophical issues. And both of the thinkers I was looking at in that book exemplified that. The Promise of Religious Naturalism was my first book after my dissertation, and it was really, initially, the idea was to write a book on emerging options in religious ethics. Mm-hmm. And so I was looking at I was doing research on new types of liberationist ethics, what I was calling at the time post-traditionalist ethics. And these were basically folks working on kind of the progressive edge of religious traditions. Mm. And a third area was religious naturalism. And what happened, and this often happens when you're writing, and I'm sure you've experienced this, you go down a rabbit hole and you realize there's so much more to something than you thought, and that ends up becoming a new focus. Mm-hmm. So originally, the religious naturalism part was just going to be one chapter, and it expanded into this whole book. Wow. And so The Promise of Religious Naturalism is a book where I compare several different options in contemporary religious naturalism and put them into the context of the moral concerns that I think are important for us and that religious naturalism can address, specifically the ecological crisis. So that's what that was about.
Right. Okay. So now in your current work, like, what if you could put a name to one problem or two problems that you're addressing, what is it that you're trying to understand or rectify now with your current work?
So I would say that the most recent book is called American Imminence: Democracy for an Uncertain World. And it's really what I consider my first constructive project. The Promise of Religious Naturalism was still kind of doing this comparison and analysis of varieties of religious naturalism. This one is me making a claim about the traditions that have influenced me, the American pragmatist process and empirical traditions in American philosophy of religion. And making a case that, so I'm identifying this tradition is my formative tradition philosophically and theologically, and I think it has a lot to say to some of our major challenges, morally and politically in this moment. And I would describe those challenges as the aligning of several systemic types of reorganization, if not breakdown. And I think that the biggest categories for those systems would be the planetary and the political. So planetary systems in a state of breakdown, political systems in a state of breakdown. So the aligning of these kinds of breakdowns creates all types of and forms of uncertainty. And in response to uncertainty that's as intense and as kind of profound as we experience through the aligning of these systemic breakdowns, that produces a a quest for certainty, is the way John Dewey puts it. And you see that showing up in the rise of authoritarianism and far-right populist movements around the world. So the problem is basically systemic breakdown producing all these kinds of political reactions that are understandable in a certain sense, but counterproductive with respect to advances in democracy, human rights, social and environmental justice, and really addressing our larger problems.
So in your book, thank you, that was all very helpful. In your book, you talk about sort of the underlying assumptions or ideas or types of reverence that we have that have contributed to these breakdowns, right? Like let's start with nature, right? So what kind of thinking about nature has contributed to the breakdown of our politics and our environment?
So I think the most fundamental thing is the sense of being separate from rather than within nature. So a sense of separation from. And Alfred North Whitehead is one of the philosophers that I work on in the book, and it's influenced me. And he talks about the bifurcation of nature. And essentially it's the problem of how do we understand the human mind and mental types of behavior, mental qualities in human experience in an otherwise seemingly largely physical, natural world. Mm-hmm. And so there is a difference we experience, I think, between kind of first-person self-awareness and mental and intellectual cognitive experience and, the world of nature. Mm-hmm. And so Whitehead's point is that fundamental sense of bifurcation shows up in lots of other ways. Dewey talks about it in different terms as a nest of dualisms that have divided, certainly divided humans from nature, divided our ways of thinking about history and nature from one another, nature and culture. You can see that dualism or those kinds of binary categories shaping human relationships as well. I mean, we think about gender in binary terms. We think about, we kind of live our world in the West specifically through a set of ontological oppositions. These things are fundamentally and different from one another. And I would say that that's the most fundamental issue in the way that's kind of like the core thing I think that leads to a misunderstanding of and a lack of concern for human impact in the natural world. The mistake is that it's something separate from us and that it's static rather than dynamic, that it's not, and that we're apart from it, rather than understanding ourselves as within nature and therefore affected by whatever it is we're doing. So it's that fundamental opposition that shapes a bunch of other challenges that we face, I think.
Wow. Okay. I have a handful of questions. So what is it that makes us think that we're separate?
Well, I think part of it is I think we could say part of it is phenomenological or experiential, how we experience being a human self. I mean, we experience self-awareness. We experience intentionality in our way of being in the world. We experience mind, and we don't see or experience mind or intentionality or consciousness out in the more than human world. And so there's this at least in the West. Now, you could say in animist traditions and indigenous traditions, the concept of a person or of self or of animacy is broader. But in the Western philosophical traditions, there's this real sense of a difference between, human mental, res cogitans and res extensa, the way Descartes talked about this, extended things that take up space on the one hand, and consciousness, things of consciousness on the other. I think part of it's experiential, but then you set up, you set up human systems with that kind of an assumption built into it, and then you're building in a disregard for nature in the way we think about and perform economy, the way we think about what community is about. We think about it strictly in interpersonal and human, rather than in socio-ecological terms. So I think you've got the core experience of a contrast, not a contrast, an opposition between consciousness and nature that then ends up showing up and is replicated and becomes, problematic in terms of having an impact on the world at larger scales.
I like that. I like that a lot. So you're talking about these sort of fundamental oppositions, and you even mentioned gender, right? So what is the alternative, right? And why should we? How do we justify, say, taking a view that isn't oppositional, that doesn't think of the world in terms of either or?
So it's a great question. So, and this is why I think it's important to, as a philosopher and a theologian, to kind of see how some of what's going on in the world around gender and around divisions between environmentalists and business. I mean, all these different binaries and oppositions that shape and distort, I think, the way we live in the world, come back to some basic kind of metaphysical and even in some ways deeply theological assumptions. So we could think about the varieties of metaphysics, both Western and Eastern cosmologies and metaphysics, as offering several different possibilities. There are dualisms of various kinds, and it typically comes down to the material and the conscious, something like that. There are monisms of various kinds. Let's say, well, everything's physical or natural, or everything's mental. So you've got the idealist monists. You've also got the physicalist monists, and then you have what I think are to me, the more compelling options, and also I think the more complicated ones, are varieties of integral monism,
okay.
Where you've got the most fundamental things that exist are phenomena that exhibit both mental and physical aspects. So this is what, for me, Whitehead is a primary source on this, and he the way I describe his idea of like the fundamental things that exist in the world, he refers to as actual entities, or actual occasions at different times, and they have a mental and a physical aspect to them. So also for Whitehead does the concept of God. God has both of these aspects. So Whitehead's metaphysics is it's like a fractal metaphysics, in a sense that you see patterns repeated over and over again from the subatomic to the intergalactic, and to the theological to the personal. And so it's not that there are different kinds of things in the world fundamentally, but that every kind of thing that there is has multiple aspects to them. So and then if that's your most basic picture of the world, then you can start to think about differences, not in terms of oppositions, but in terms of contrasts. And the possibility is that those contrasts can be mutually enriching and experientially deepening contrasts, rather than oppositions that need to be embattled, right? So and this is the difference, I think, that kind of a metaphysics creates. It creates a potential for thinking through and living in our world as a world of differences and contrast that can be mutually enriching and enhancing, rather than a world of oppositions that are threatening and embattled.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that. No one has tried to, and it might be a long time before somebody tries again to explain Whitehead's metaphysics in 30 seconds on my podcast. So I appreciate that a lot. And I think it was lucid, which is really nice. And is there not also something about human beings where it's just like it's easier to simplify things, right? Like thinking through things in terms of being mutually enriching contrasts, right? Or variations in degree. It takes a little bit more effort and complexity in our thinking. And I think it takes a lot to get to that sort of point. Do you see us as being able to integrate this kind of richer, more complex thinking on a broader scale?
So, couple of ideas about that. So, two initial responses. Whitehead talks about this. The most fundamental fallacy in human thinking is the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And it's essentially that we think, we project into the world categories and concepts that are rooted in a primarily visual encounter with the world. So if we think about empiricisms as philosophies of knowledge that are rooted in and appeal to experience, you say sensory empiricisms are the idea that, and this is classical empiricism, we can only know what we directly experience through the senses. Mm-hmm. Now, Whitehead is an example of, and William James is an example of this, and so is John Dewey, of a radical empiricist who will argue that all that we know through experience, and sensory experience is in some ways more fundamental than cognitive experience or the experience of consciousness. But beneath sensory experience, there's affective experience, there's felt experience. And that's harder to, that's preconceptual experience. The problem is we live through the world kind of in this kind of middle space of the sensory, and the sensory ends up kind of becoming the basis for the way we conceptualize and categorize the world. And our thinking never rises to the complexity and the fluidity of what actually exists. It's always compartmentalizing and categorizing and dividing, right? And I think, so there's that tendency in human thinking, and you could say that's just built into the way the human brain works. You could also, but then you can also say that then you develop language systems and philosophical systems that reinforce those tendencies. So there's that. I also think that John Dewey has a lot of insight on this because he ties in a quest for certainty. He interprets a quest for certainty as in some ways related to a quest for security. Yeah. So we want to have certain objective, absolute knowledge because somehow that helps us to feel more secure in the world. So in response to the question, how can we live and think in a way that rises to the complexity of a world of contrast rather than oppositions? I think there are multiple ways to address that question. You could think about, well, how do we need to rethink the way the mind works, the way the brain works, and develop and teach different ways of thinking about human thinking and cognition, and teach that and create curricula and approaches to learning that cultivate and respond to the affective depths of experience, and don't favor necessarily cognitive or sensory, right? But think at the multiple levels. That would be one way of approaching the question. Changing the way we teach and learn in response to the way we understand the real complexity of the brain.
Hmm.
I think that there are, I think that there are other traditions around the world historically too that are much more attuned to a world of contrast rather than oppositions. To the idea, to Whitehead's pan-experientialism, the idea that experience is not just conscious experience, it's not just human, but that it goes all the way down. I think a lot of animist and indigenous traditions exhibit a sensitivity to that we have as modern Westerners and postmodern Westerners a lot to learn from. So it's partly about learning not only that our brain works differently than we thought, but other cultural systems have a lot for us to learn from as well.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. So just to clarify, and maybe we can unpack this a bit because it's interesting. When you say consciousness goes all the way down, I understand because I have read Whitehead. I understand what you mean about concrescence and the like, but I'm curious for people listening. Does that mean, for example, that there is consciousness or some degree of consciousness in a rock? Right? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, for Whitehead, it's not that consciousness goes all the way down; it's that experience goes all the way down. So we tend, as human beings, we tend to think of experience in the terms of conscious experience,
right?
Intentional consciousness, representational consciousness. But for Whitehead, experience is deeper than that. And the most fundamental things that exist, if you go all the way down to what's most fundamental, he calls that an actual occasion or entity, and that is a subject of experience. It's not conscious, but it does have a kind of a mental and a physical aspect to it. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean? Does that mean that rocks are thinking things? Not in the way that we think about thinking and cognition. So he does talk. It's a fractal cosmology or metaphysics, as I said. So you see these patterns showing up. Mm-hmm. The most fundamental things are occasions or entities, but you also have varieties of social systems, and a social system or a society could be personally ordered or conformally ordered. A rock is a conformally ordered society of occasions. It's not one thing, it's a bunch of other things that are conformally related to one another. Mm. They're not conscious, but it's already a multiplicity. And those things are combined or integrated because there's some kind of a resonance between and among them. It's not conscious resonance, but there's something that holds it together. A personally ordered society, on the other hand, is a collective or a multiplicity that's not just formally or spatially contiguous in relationship, but has a common intention or aim that binds them together. So, an organ in the human body is an example of a personally ordered system. There's a purpose or a function that holds the pieces together, right? So no, it doesn't mean that rocks are conscious, but it does mean that there's a lot more complexity to a rock, for instance, than we tend to, in our everyday lives, think about.
Okay, that's really helpful. So to sort of draw that back to our modern crisis, are there things, we've been talking about metaphysics a lot, right? The way that we view the world. Are there things about the Western religious traditions that we've inherited specifically that promote these kinds of, we might say, oversimplified or dualistic ways of thinking?
Yeah, I think, and this is what I tried to show in American Immanence, is that the core problem you could say, I really think that the fundamental problem is a concept of the divine that is omni-structured, so omnipotent, omniscient, all-knowing, it sets up this idea about power and value that is that we then idealize in lots of different ways. So that you've got this concept of a creator God who is, ontologically distinct from the rest of creation. And so there's an opposition. Even if there's a creative relationship, this God brings this creation into existence. The premise of classical theism and much of popular theism, I think, is that there's a fundamental difference, right, between creation and creator. So you've got this opposition that's built into the way so many folks think about the sacred, that then shows up in all kinds of other, of human and social systems. So the highest that we think that theists, traditional theists think of, the highest thing is God. God is unitary one, all powerful, and anything else that has power is in a sense kind of in a competition with this one. And so you got unitary and so this divine being is unitary and oppositional by nature. And that's the concept of the idealized integration of power and value that then shapes the way we think about power and value in all kinds of other circumstances. So, I mean, if we think about, everything becomes zero sum, right? You think about what the heck's happening in the UK with Brexit and the way people are thinking about that. If you think about American, in the United States, our parties and our congressional dysfunctions. I mean, it's zero-sum stuff. And my sense is that those ideas about power and value are traceable back to a concept of God. And so, to me, that's what the work of political theology is it's helping to map and analyze and kind of bring to surface, the way that concept of God shows up in other ways. The way we think about the nation, the way we think about a race, the way we think about class, the way we think about political parties, the way we think about, the true, the good, and the beautiful.
So when you're talking about the nation and a race and a class and what have you, are you saying that the problem is we think the power source is unitary, like there is a best option or a most powerful option and we must align ourselves with or revere that? Like, how does this, you said this is the work of political theology, so then what would we see? How does this idea of God actually make us think particular ways about race or class or what have you?
Well, I think that this idea of God as unitary and oppositional, which is a way of interpreting, for me, a way of naming, I should say, the omni-structured God of classical theism, which also shows up, I think, in a lot of popular theism, meaning assumptions about the divine that are in place at a lot of churches, for example, a lot of Christian churches. That unitary oppositional ideal then is a kind of supremacist ideal, right? It's like this God is supreme because of these features or aspects or qualities, is above and beyond all other possible concepts of the sacred. Monotheism is a kind of theistic supremacy. And that idea, I'm saying, is replicated in lots of other human, relationships. So we think about, there's, that there's a superior race, that there's a superior way of being a sexual creature, right? That there's that job creators are better than, are superior to workers or for folks who have been, are kind of stuck on the bottom rungs of the ladder of meritocracy or whatever. So I think it ends up setting up this very hierarchical and supremacist way of thinking and being in relationship.
Yeah, I like that. It's very smart. So what then? What is the alternative then? What's the alternative?
Well, so this is what the constructive part of my book, American Immanence, is trying to articulate, is to say that there is an alternative tradition. I call it the dissenting tradition, and of theology. Sure. And I'm talking specifically about American traditions, and I call it an immanentalist tradition. So the sacred is not the divine, or I still think God can be a useful symbol for this, but it's a distributed understanding of God rather than a concentrated understanding. It's not a monopolistic concept of God, but it's God, a concept of God or the sacred or the divine as distributed and immanent within the world. And that sets up a whole different way of thinking about our concepts of the sacred shape the way we think about power and value, among other things. Right? But if our concept of ultimacy, to use Paul Tillich's kind of categories here, is immanent rather than ontologically transcendent, is within the world being the universe, nature, experience, and it's a part of everything, then I think we set up a way of thinking about power and value that's not oppositional or unitary, but this distributed and complementary. And so I think it sets up a whole different logic for understanding difference, for understanding community, for understanding the human place in planetary systems. It doesn't prescribe ideas about right, wrong, and justice, but it sets up a different logic for thinking about basic things. So the immanentalist tradition in American philosophy of religion is one alternative to what I was describing as a problematic tradition. There are other possibilities. I've already mentioned indigenous and animist traditions that I'm not an expert on, but I think that they have some similar ideas about immanence and complementarity and a kind of pan-experientialism or pan-psychism that is relevant for rethinking the divine and the sacred in our time.
And why is this better, to bring this full circle, why is this a better system or way of thinking about things for addressing our political and environmental crises?
Well, so I think there are a couple ways to answer this question. So as a religious, somebody that kind of self-identifies as a religious naturalist, I would say it's better for a couple of reasons, at least, right? One is that I think that it's a naturalistic concept of the sacred. In other words, the idea that there is a supreme being with consciousness that is behind everything that exists, that's an impossibility for a naturalist. The idea that there's consciousness or intentionality that's disembodied or discarnate, that's something that a naturalist doesn't have access to. Instead, the idea that there are aspects of nature being everything, nature naturing, nature natured, nature doing what nature does, that there are aspects of nature naturing that are sacred and that we can revere. That's something that a naturalist can say, I have access to. That's not to say that there are spirits out there with consciousness running around through the world, but it's to say that aspects of what nature already is and is doing provoke a response that I think is useful to name as religious. So one way I think that, one part of the answer to the question is why is this better, is because I would say it's to me it's a more intellectually and I would say even spiritually accessible idea. One for which I think the sciences provide a kind of access point into it. Not that they exhaust what is knowable, but that they, it's compatible, I think, with some of, the sciences. So the other reason, and this is where the pragmatist in me comes out, the other reason I think that it's a better option is because I said, it sets up a different logic of relationship. Rather than a supremacist one, rather than a Unitarian oppositional one, rather than zero-sum, negotiations of power and value, you have a distributed model of power. You have an understanding of value as emergent out of complex processes rather than antecedent in a supreme being, and that ends up providing a kind of foundation for thinking about coalitions and collaborations and co-creative, ventures of various kinds. So it sets up that idea of ultimacy sets up a different logic for moving through the world that I think has a lot of pragmatic value and utility.
And you mean here pragmatic kind of in both senses, right? In the philosophical sense and also in the sense that people usually mean colloquially, as in it's useful.
Yes, I think it's useful. And I certainly mean it in the philosophical sense. And these are ideas that come out of an American pragmatist philosophical tradition. But useful, and this is what the subtitle of American Immanence is, Democracy for an Uncertain World. Because I think we're facing a number of globally scaled challenges that require new types of collaborations and coalitions, right? And if we can, and if we have a theological vision that frames and contextualizes and even gives energy to that work, I think that's a really useful thing. And that's what I'm trying to do in this book, is to say we've got a bunch of multi-system breakdowns, planetary and political, to name some big types of systems. And these are producing all kinds of complicated problems and challenges that require, the best of our collective imaginations and collective problem solving. And what sort of a political framework is conducive to that? And I would say, a radically democratic one. And a radically democratic kind of political, the idea of a radically democratic approach to these problems is, I think, supported and framed very well by an immanentalist understanding of the sacred.
So these new types of collaborations and coalitions, like what hypothetically might one look like? How does this democracy work?
So I think that there are some examples of this. Paul Hawken is one of the entrepreneurs behind the Smith and Hawken company, which was, I think it was actually a gardening tool kind of household goods business of some kind. And he's very ecologically minded, Paul Hawken. He wrote a book called Blessed Unrest, and it was a few years ago. And he spent time giving talks and working with communities all around the world. And he says, and this is just anecdotally, but he thinks that we're living through one of history's largest ever people's movements. And these are small, grassroots scaled communities, sometimes faith-based, other times just, whatever, just grassroots communities working on social, environmental, economic, and racial justice issues. And he sees it happening everywhere. But it's not, when I think about the world and what's shaping the world, that's not what I'm thinking about. We see what's in the headlines. We see spectacle. We see, so we think about the highest levels of our political and economic system, and not what's happening in a distributed way. And that's partly because of the way news and media work and whatnot. But my point is that there's a lot of innovation around organizing communities and working for justice that already exists in the world. It's just distributed. It doesn't really have a center to it. There's not an ideological vanguard that's presenting this particular vision for the way things ought to be. And so we don't notice it. So part of the work of folks who are committed to shaping a more just and equitable world along these lines is to bring some visibility to this. So examples would include, I think, the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, the 350 movement, the climate justice movement, the rise of the commons movement and commoning. It's kind of taking the idea of transition communities, which really are especially big, I think, in the UK. These are all examples of what I'm talking about. And what I'm working on now in my teaching and writing is really about developing some more practical ideas about what it means to bring some of this to life. I can say more about that, or we could move to another question.
Well, we're actually kind of almost coming up on time. This is flying by. Why don't you go ahead and flesh out what you were talking about there? I think that's really cool.
Okay, so briefly, the American immanence ends with this idea of resilient democracy. And the concept for it is that that the distributed nature of the people's movement that Paul Hawken talks about is one of the strengths of that movement, because in any system there needs to be some redundancy and some dispersal of agency and creativity. But if it's not integrated, if it's not connected, then it can dissolve. It just becomes a bunch of disparate things that are happening. Resilient democracy is about integrating the disparate, emergent, innovative, grassroots kind of social justice and environmental justice movements. That's where that book ends, with that kind of articulating that vision. Now, what I've begun to think about, what are some roles that different organizations and communities and people can play in doing this work? And I'm thinking at the moment that there are several different types of roles. There are agitators who kind of call into question existing systems or status quo that kind of shake things up a little bit. And you can do that. You don't have to be a militant to be an agitator, but it's not necessarily, in fact, I would say that an oppositional model can be problematic, but there need to be agitators. There need to be innovators or incubators, people who are coming up with new ideas about how to do things. There need to be connectors or weavers who are bringing the disparate innovations together. And there need to be amplifiers who increase visibility and raise awareness. So, and I think you could think about examples of people who kind of exemplify each of those tendencies, but you don't have to think about it just at an individual level. I think you could think about it at the level of organizations and communities as well. But I would say that any kind of a resilient system and a resilient democratic system needs folks and organizations playing all of those roles.
I really appreciate something I've been thinking about for the last few minutes. I really appreciate the really intensive philosophical rigor and depth that underlies these really nice, practical ideas that you have about how we can, make some sort of progress as a society. I think I loved the way you were talking about these agitators and amplifiers and that sort of thing. And I think you're absolutely right. And it's so common for academics to have some critiques, or have some metaphysical ideas, but it's very rare to sort of see that start to live in the real world. But I feel like, you're not actually just accurately depicting the world, but talking prescriptively about something really cool that could happen. Like this vision feels actually actionable, I suppose is what I'm saying. I think that that's really important.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an important. I mean, if the world is the way I think it is, then just sitting on the sidelines as an academic or an intellectual isn't really very responsible. So, not that I'm out there as the activist shaking things up, but I do think there's a responsibility for intellectuals to come up with some actionable, operationalizable ideas, right?
Yeah, and you sort of pass the ideas around, and that's kind of what I am trying to do here with this project, right? Is act as a linkage between ideas that are, I think, important and powerful, and people who wouldn't otherwise hear them, And so, so I will do what I can to get this and other really interesting ideas out there. That is a promise.
I think I'm glad you said that, because what you're doing with the blogs and the podcast is a perfect example of connecting and amplifying, right? You're connecting audiences to some new ideas and thinkers. You're amplifying questions that you have, that others may have, and also the ideas and projects of people that you invite onto your show. So, yeah, I think it's a great example of what I'm talking about here.
Well, thank you for validating my work. I appreciate that.
Great. Yeah.
You're my mom. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a good point to say bye. I will provide links to Mike's books in the show notes. They are academic but accessible and actually really beautiful reads. I took out a bunch of quotes and wrote them down because they're very lovely. So thank you again, Mike, for coming on, and thank you everybody for tuning in. I will talk to you next week.
Okay. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.